Ah, so thank you very much for joining us today. And Sylvia, thanks so much for putting this on. I really appreciate everybody from Buying Legal Counsel taking some time to join us for this important presentation. Specifically, we're going to be talking about, what you need to know now and how to avoid risks. As you've been sitting through these different presentations, we've learned a lot about the cyber areas. Joining us today is myself, as Sylvia introduced me, but also I'm really pleased that my colleague Shay Colson is joining us. And I'll just say one small thing about Shay is there are a few people who can think about cyber risk as analytically and as thoroughly as he does. When he sees a cyber incident, he is 6 steps ahead of me in most cases in terms of what's the root cause, what's the analysis, and how it's going. So I'm really pleased to have him on here, and he's going to be really walking us through this. This, as I said before, is one of 4 things that we're doing. Last week, we did our privileged data, understanding the cybersecurity challenges with your legal vendors, really kind of talking through this issue, talking about the holistic nature of it, some of the controls, kind of level setting on what kind of threats are out there. Today, we're going to do a deeper dive, though, right? Now, we're going to talk about, what you need to know. What do these attacks actually look like? How do your attackers view your legal vendor portfolio? And we'll give you some other ideas around it. Then next week, I want to encourage you to continue to join us, as we'll be having one of our friends a couple of our friends, from Prudential joining us to talk about their cyber risk program and really talk about what they've done to reduce this risk across their organization. And then finally, we'll be bringing in some colleagues from the legal management consulting side of Duff & Phelps to talk about contracts and data governance and that ultimate question of, well, if I can't avoid the risk, as we're going to talk about today, if I can't mitigate the risk, as we're talking about next week, well, how do I transfer the risk? And that'll be week 4. So I really encourage you to continue to be part of this presentation. As always, as Sylvia says, ask us questions, and we're very available offline. Now, I'm going to be quiet, though, and turn things over to the man of the hour, Mr. Shay Colson, to take it away. Shay?
Great. Thanks, Ryan. And again, thank you, Sylvia and the Buying Legal Counsel team for hosting us. You've been great to work with, and we're really excited to continue this conversation with everybody who's participating here. I think that's one of the things that really resonates well with both our approach and yours, is that it's a conversation, it's collaborative, it's dynamic, and that's the way that it succeeds. And I think that's true of cyber as well, is that it really is a team sport, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But I do want to set the stage. And I want to make sure that we hit some of these marks and hopefully by the end, demystify a little bit of what cyber means to your risk, to your business, to your legal vendor community, and give you some actual tangible examples and statistics around that, and then come back around and conclude with some strategies that, again, are tangible, that are things that can be put into practice in your firms, in your organizations, and that help you feel empowered to make better risk-based decisions. I think that's really one of the things that gets missed often in the cyber conversation. Last week, we had a slide very much like this in our presentation, talking about the impacts of a data breach. And I wanted to include that here for a couple of reasons. One certainly is continuity for our little mini series that we're producing here on cyber. I think it's nice to have a tie from one episode to the next. But the other one is, I think this slide does a very nice job of something that we collectively struggle to do, which is to put cyber in business terms. So certainly there are lots of technical nuances. There are lots of details that are very far down the stack of the technology that's involved. But the manifestation, the reason that cyber risk is important to us and that we're talking about it today is because it has impacts to our business. And I think if those of us who are on the legal operations side, who are in the procurement functions, who are working for the business and not necessarily working for IT or for the security office, can have the conversation with the business lens with cyber risk as the topic, will serve everybody well. So again, the impacts with your legal vendor community around their extortion attempts or business interruptions, their inability to deliver services to you, reputational damage, loss of trust, the potential for regulatory action or having to go to litigation. These are all things that we want to avoid, and these are all things that really, I think, drive some of our apprehension. I don't want to say insecurity, but Sylvia started with the good puns. I might continue the trend around this topic. And so what we want to do today is really start to boil these down and help you feel empowered. And so I want to start by a poll question. So Sylvia, you could go ahead and throw that up. But I want to take a temperature here of the audience around what you think is the most common way data breaches occur in professional services firms today. I see on the screen that hosts and panelists can't vote, so I'll let you go ahead and put in your votes while the poll is up, but we've got some very common choices here, right? Misconfigured databases, disgruntled employees, lost or stolen credentials through their third parties, through unpatched servers. These are all in the running. So we'll let the poll conclude here. I'll give you one more minute to put your answer in, and then I will give you the real answer. So I certainly won't bury the lead. All right. The answer to the most common breach vector is that, yes, lost or stolen credentials, 55%. Excellent. That is the right answer.
Good job.
And yes, we know that because just earlier this spring in May, Verizon published their 2020 update of their data breach investigations report. And this report is generally the largest single collection of analysis around real-world cyber incidents. And it's very useful to help understand what's really happening out there. You know, the theme of this presentation is that benchmarking, that real-world, that data-driven analysis. And frankly, Verizon does a scaled job of that as good or better than anybody else. This year's report was over 150,000 incidents analyzed. And not only did they determine that those lost or stolen credentials are the #1 most common attack pattern, another interesting analysis piece is that large firms, now when they say firms, they mean companies, so more than 1,000 employees, not necessarily firms like a law firm, have incidents at a rate that is 20 times greater than small firms, which are those that are less than 1,000 employees. And so there are a couple of things here that I think really stand out. One is, boy, that's quite a significant increase in frequency, right? More than 20 times. But also it gets to this notion of size and scale with cybersecurity. As you grow as an organization, you necessarily have to increase your footprint, you increase your employees, you increase your number of customers, you increase your amount of data. And as a result, you end up increasing both your attractiveness as a target and your opportunity to perhaps miss a patch or miss a configuration or miss something from the technology perspective. So this is going to be a theme that we see later on. We also at Duff & Phelps Kroll do a lot of incident response ourselves. We did over 2,000 last year, and even in our own internal analysis, 40% of the cases that we were involved in last year, the attack vector was a phishing email, which is, again, driven by that use of credentials, whether it's harvesting credentials to just blast out the phishing email, or whether that email then compromises the credential and goes on down to perpetuate the attack. The other thing that we saw in our own work is that the vast majority of those who were impacted by these attacks did not have multi-factor authentication deployed. So that's one of the themes that we're going to also hit on today, is that there are steps you can take, there are steps your vendors can take, and that together with that strong collaboration, you can make a difference on your cyber risk posture. I do also want to start to demystify this idea of who the attackers are. There's a great web comic called XKCD that is kind of a satirical send-up of the technology industry, but they have this very, I think, nice analogy for how hacking really happens. And on the left, of course, we all have this idea in our mind of the special operations units that go in and steal the passwords or hack in from across the globe. And the reality in many ways is that it's much more opportunistic than that. And that attackers are generally what I would say is clever, not sophisticated. They are looking to optimize. I put in parentheses the word lazy, but they're looking to be efficient, right? Generally, they are looking for these low-hanging fruit, crimes of opportunity components. And as a result, most attacks are opportunistic as opposed to targeted. So from the perspective of that comic, far more attacks that look like the world on the right occur than look like the world on the left. And I think what we've seen is, particularly in the era of COVID and the forced move to remote work, there's been an explosion in the amount of data channels that are available. And there's been this increased requirement to retain the access, right? We have remote workers, everybody is distributed, and people need access to these data sets. They need access to these pieces of software. They need access to these machines. And so you've got this balance of needing to support all of these data channels and legitimate access, but also protect against, you know, those who would seek to do harm. There's also this other element where I think this idea that the hacker has to have these super skills is just generally not true, right? For the ability of a hacker to make a message appear on your screen or to plant a file on your computer, we have built large enterprise grade pieces of software to do just that. And it's called email. And you can do it too. And that's how these things happen. So the notion that attackers are out there with these magical tools, certainly they are in some cases. We'll talk a little bit about those, but generally that's not how it happens. And so what I'd like to encourage us to do today is to try and put ourselves in their footprint first. Think about how an attacker looks at an organization, be it a law firm or an e-discovery provider or any vendor really, or even your own organization. Think about what they're looking for, what they're evaluating in terms of those easy targets, and then think about how that manifests in what you might call risk exposure. I think this is a term that we've all started to hear more of in the news. You know, you hear that there was an exposed S3 bucket left open on Amazon and it contained patient records, or that someone left data exposed. These are the sort of things I mean when I talk about an opportunistic attack rather than a targeted attack. And this comes, go ahead, Ryan.
Interrupt you real quick, maybe especially for this audience, what does that mean when it's exposed, right? How does that
Great
actually
question.
correlate into the reality of day-to-day life?
Yep, great question. And so when something is left exposed, what they really mean when they say that is that there was no authentication in front of it, and it was open and accessible to anybody who went and essentially pointed their web browser at that address. And so the challenge here is that not to avoid putting your data in the cloud, don't use S3 buckets on Amazon, not to take advantage of all the benefits that technology can bring us, but to do it in a way that is controlled, right? And so when we start to see how attackers look at organizations, they're looking for that kind of digital footprint. How big is this organization? Have they implemented these security controls? They might call them security metrics. Or did they leave the front door wide open and thus exposed? Or are there a lot of at-risk digital identities that I can go and then leverage? Maybe they require authentication to see the data that is on that website, but I've got a bunch of usernames and passwords that I picked up from somewhere else that I can try. These are the sort of things that end up actually resulting in these breaches, but they're also the sort of things that we know very well how to mitigate or avoid at scale. So I want to give you some real world, real recent examples of what happens to law firms in the wild. And there was a great report last month from Citizen Lab, which is run out of the Monk School of Public Affairs at the University of Toronto. And they have been tracking what they call a hack for hire operation. Everybody likes a cool name, right, in the hacking world. So they're calling this group Dark Basin. I'm not sure why they picked that name, but it certainly sounds menacing. So they get points for that.
There's a dice they can roll and gives different words.
Yeah, that's a little toolkit. Gotcha.
Generator.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Good. But it was really interesting for a couple of reasons. One is the amount and duration of this campaign. So the organization in question targeted thousands of individuals and hundreds of institutions over multiple years. And really they were just doing it at a very low level, very simplistic approach, and it was highly effective. One of the things that stood out particularly for this audience is that legal services were targeted. I think the phrase they used was heavily represented in the activity of this, in both US firms and global law firms, and corporate litigation and financial services were disproportionately represented. They didn't disclose which firms were targeted, which was nice of them, and they certainly didn't disclose how many attorneys within each firm were targeted, but they did disclose some of the attack patterns of this organization. And I thought it would be useful to just give you some context to what these clever attackers, again, not sophisticated, are doing. And one of their attacks that was highly effective would be to send a phishing email that looked like a subscription to a pornography site. It would say, hey, thanks for signing up for this very strange type of pornography. Oh, by the way, if you wish to unsubscribe, click here. And they knew that this would spur action by sending this type of email to people's professional accounts, except that the unsubscribe link wasn't really an unsubscribe link, right? It was a phishing attempt that they would then say, yep, sign in here and we'll unsubscribe you. And they knew that because of the content of the email, it would be less likely to be reported to the IT department, lest someone potentially think that they actually had subscribed to this pornography feed. And so again, it's a very clever, very effective way to work. It's low tech, it's low touch. It preys on both the existing data channels of email and the existing social structures, and it's highly effective. Again, it's not that we can't defeat this, and it's not that we don't know how to address it, but it does take a level of effort to implement that compensating control of multi-factor authentication. And if you had just deployed that piece, go ahead, Ryan.
No, I'm just going to jump in and say, and apologies there, but I know you probably want to take a drink of water too. The IT departments that we work with, and I just want to also explain this because I'm sure other people have seen this, right? I know of at least 4 people who had a similar attack happen to them. Luckily, in my social circles, most of us are fairly familiar with this attack pattern, but I could see somebody even say, well, my parents getting it and being horrified and not wanting to report it to IT. And I think it should make it very clear that most IT departments know this attack tactic. Their first thought isn't going to go to your personal preferences. Their first thought's going to go to, great, now we're being targeted. What other steps we need to do? How do I better protect myself? How do we let, is it time to send an email to everybody in the company saying, hey, we've been targeted. Just keep an eye out. Let us know if you see things. These reporting mechanisms, as well as the multi-factor authentication controls that Shay was alluding to, are very helpful. And it's good for the community of your organization to not be afraid to share these things, especially when they're banking on that you not doing that.
Yep, I think that's a really good point, Ryan, and it goes to this theme of communication and collaboration. Nobody asks to be targeted. You didn't do anything wrong to get this email, and so you shouldn't feel bad about raising your hand if something doesn't feel right or look right or seem right, or if it takes you to a place where you have to log in and you don't feel like you should have to log in. It is okay to stop and go talk to somebody about it in your organization. And I think empowering your team and having your legal vendors empower their teams to do the same thing is only going to benefit everybody. But I also don't want to gloss over the fact that there are still sophisticated actors out there who are putting an incredible amount of energy into targeting high value entities. And again, very recent news article, this from just last week in Wired, great technology reporter Lily Hay Newman had an article about Russian hackers who are leveraging email in a slightly different way. And what they're doing is finding targets who have what I would call the perfect storm, which is they're about to make an acquisition and they have missing security capabilities on their email servers. And what these attackers will do will be to first penetrate the organization and figure out what the acquisition target is and the price, because they can leverage that data. And then they go and impersonate not only the CEO of that organization, but another outside counsel. So they'll go to the target organization who's acquiring a different company and say, hey, I'm the CEO of this different company. I just want to introduce you to my outside counsel who's going to facilitate the transaction, except it's not a real attorney. It's a fake attorney that these attackers are leveraging the insecure email deployment to impersonate, and then inserting, oh, just send that money over here, wire it to this account in, jurisdiction X, and we'll just complete this transaction. And as a result, they're making off with millions of dollars, and everybody in the middle is confused because the real CEO of the acquiree is not having these conversations. The acquiring organization thinks they're finalizing their transaction, and then by the time everybody realizes that this has happened, the money is gone, and so are the hackers. And I think, again, there are these sophisticated attackers out there. They're perpetrating these attacks, but they're few and far between, right? Your goal is not to try and prevent or combat these at scale, because frankly, you can't. The FBI even can't. There was another great article last week. It was a big news week from Christopher Wray, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation here in the United States, detailing what they're calling Operation Fox Hunt and some of the cyber and physical operations by China in the United States. And I thought some of the statistics would be sobering. Again, we're trying to benchmark the real world here. The the director noted that the FBI opens a new China-related counterintelligence case every 10 hours. Not takes a report, not gets a call, opens a case every 10 hours. And he noted that particularly calling out China being involved in mass hacking, in identity theft, in intellectual property espionage. And I thought the statistic at the bottom was most telling, at least from the perspective of a US-based organization, that all 56 of the Bureau's field offices have active investigations into China's attempted theft of technology or actual theft of technology. And so, again, I don't want to gloss over the fact that there are these large, sophisticated organizations out there, and they do end up targeting law firms. And there's this interesting dynamic around the transitive nature of threats where your firms are their firms. This was an example from a couple of years ago where Clark Hill, and a firm that many of us are likely familiar with, took on the case of a Chinese dissident filing an asylum request here in the United States. Not just any Chinese dissident, he happened to be on the outs with the Chinese government at the time. And he even told the firm, hey, by taking my case, I appreciate it, but you're going to get targeted. They're going to come after you to try and discredit you. The firm said, nope, no problem, we got it, we're gonna handle it. Turns out they didn't handle it, which might be a surprise to no one. But the problem is you might be using Clark Hill for construction law or for some employee benefits work or you know, for some healthcare related activities. They have a myriad of practice areas. But on the other hand, they're also working to support this Chinese dissident in his filing. And as a result, ended up being attacked by the Chinese. And so this challenge of not necessarily understanding, just because you don't do sensitive work with this firm doesn't mean that they aren't doing sensitive work with someone else that either might make them an attractive target for these more sophisticated actors, or generally that they are going to fall victim to an opportunistic attack and that your data or your relationship with them will be at risk, I think is really one of the facts that we need to understand, and not do it in an accusatory tone, right? Not do it to say, you aren't good enough, I can't do this with you, but to say, this is the reality, this is happening, I want to work with you, I appreciate you as a business partner, we just need to do it securely. And to close out the story on Clark Hill, the dissident who was not handled very well by the firm is still pursuing a civil suit against the firm for their inability to secure his data, which was disclosed by that attack. So it's a bit of an ongoing saga, but hopefully this helps provide a little bit of the reality check in terms of what's going on out there, and we can pivot some to what you can do to avoid these risks.
Yeah, and I think that, Shay, that's a great point. I think a lot of people are probably sitting here thinking about this, you know, between last week and this week, you know, probably feeling like, how do I get a handle on this? How do I figure out what I need to do first, right? I am charged by my organization to help vet and understand these law firms and their role for both our company and the work we're going to give them. And this is now a dimension that either we are managing, but not maybe fully understanding in some ways, or more importantly, we're not managing, right? This is new and something that we need to be more involved in. So what are some of the things that the organization should think about as they start thinking about their portfolio? What are the things that they should think about as they think about how to understand this risk, with the goal of potentially avoiding these risks if at all possible?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I love that you're bringing it back to a more tangible piece of, okay, what can I do? I don't personally like the kind of boogeyman style approach to cyber. I feel like we can all understand it. We can all get better at it. And I want to help, you know, this audience do that, right? So let's be honest about your goal, right? Your goal is to implement realistic cyber risk management. Again, an article from last week in the Wall Street Journal had a great piece from two supply chain professors of practice about extending cybersecurity safeguards into your value chain. For firms that use outside legal vendors, whether they're outside counsel, whether they're e-discovery, matter management, other technology providers, they are part of how you deliver value to your clients and your customers, and they need to be a part of this conversation. Your goal, however, is to just minimize those opportunistic attacks. I don't want to have anybody here think that you've got to fight the Russians or the Chinese. Those are not your charges. Your charge is to leverage the expertise that you already have in terms of who's in your portfolio, what they do for your business to add value, and how you can use that knowledge combined with this baseline cybersecurity risk exposure construct to optimize the level of diligence, the type of diligence, the amount of diligence that you do, and bring your standards and expectations for success in security to your vendor community. So how might you do that? I want to be very tangible about this. On the left, you see again that diagram of how an attacker views an organization. But there's some things about looking at a vendor from the outside or an organization from the outside that are really helpful as we look to act on risk exposure. The first is that it's objective, right? This is data that's visible to the outside, to anybody who looks, and it doesn't, it's not subject to the influence or spin of an organization, and it can be evaluated in an absolute fashion. I think the element of being external is critical here, in that if you can see it, that means anybody else can see it. And so if there are deficiencies or weaknesses or concerns that are publicly visible, you not only have those to discuss, but then does that give lie to other things going on the inside of the organization? And the third element is that it can be done discreetly. I think the ability to do this type of evaluation initially without the participation of the firms is not something that you should think about as being sneaky, but something you should think about as being a way to optimize your level of energy and the level of effort and energy of the security resources at your firms. They have more on their plate than they can handle. Adding one more security assessment before you figure out what you're going to do with them is probably not the best use of anybody's time. But let me step through each of these elements and kind of break down what a digital footprint looks like, what the security metrics might look like, what the identity piece looks like, so that you know what to look for when you're out there. I think the analogy that we like to use for digital footprint is that this is really equivalent to going and looking at the property lines of the address of the house. We'll carry this house metaphor throughout, but it really gives you the lay of the land. It goes here, it doesn't go there. And so you can look at things like their domain registrations. How many domains do they have? How many hosting providers are they using? What countries are they operating in? Just to get that sense of literally the lay of the land. It is this wide, it is this deep, and it helps you understand what's in the bucket that you're looking at and what's out. This then can be turned, go ahead, Ryan.
No, so is this information, this is public, right? People can just get it where they need to, right?
Yep, absolutely. It's not only is it public, but it has to be that way for many of the underlying internet technologies to work in terms of how things are routed, how websites are reconciled, how when you type in www.lawfirm.com, it knows to go to a certain server in a certain set of machines in a cloud instance. All of this is underlying the technology that we kind of use transparently every day. But that means that you can go and look it up and build this profile, just like an attacker would, to help get a sense of what that footprint really looks like. So once you have kind of the property lines, it's time to do a drive-by of the house. And one of the things, I think Ryan went and found this picture, which I actually really like. You might see this ad with no picture as, you know, cute 40s bungalow. Until you go look at it, you don't realize that it has its own concerns, right? And I think this is true of many of the deployments of organizations that certainly we've helped clients examine, that there are visibilities that we can take advantage of. We're not going in the house, we're not doing a walkthrough, we're literally just looking from the curb and starting to see, yeah, you've got some issues there on the roof, you got some window issues. There's digital equivalents, certainly, of these, and these material weaknesses, again, are the sort of things that both opportunistic and targeted attackers will take advantage of. I like this notion that these metrics can be used to baseline a vendor against someone else, another vendor in your portfolio, another firm in your pool. And there is this notion of, you don't want to be the worst looking house on the block, right? You don't necessarily want to be the worst performing firm in a portfolio. The last piece in terms of this house analogy is these at-risk digital identities, which you might think of as the keys that can open these doors. There is a bustling trade of usernames and passwords and other profile data that is either for sale or just stolen and dumped to build kind of hacker credibility on various different places around the internet. And it really does not take much to start to think about when people reuse passwords, when multi-factor authentication is not in place. These are the sort of things that can really literally open the door for attackers, and getting a sense of what's out there and the scope of the exposure for a particular legal vendor can be very insightful. And I think also comes back to some of these challenges around scale. If you have a small 4-person, 4-attorney shop where there's a little bit of support staff and a very small footprint, you might not see the type of exposure where a global law firm with thousands of attorneys who needs to have people all over the world might struggle to manage these identities. So we've actually done quite a bit of this analysis for our clients, and I wanted to share, again, in the spirit of benchmarking, what this data looks like as of this month. And I'm going to start with these identities on the left because we have seen a marked uptick in the exposure of at-risk digital identities in the last 30 days. We have seen it go up more than 10 times from what it was last month. And this is the average firm over the thousands that we've looked at, which means that there are many, many hundreds who have more identities exposed than this in the last 30 days. And this becomes a significant challenge when you also think about it in terms of the size of the attack surface for the average firm. Right? The average law firm in our data set is operating over 40 servers. They've got 4 email servers. Again, we've talked about how that can be a challenge. And it's not that having more is bad, but having more means you have more to secure, more to monitor, more operational challenges, and you probably are not scaling your operational team at the same rate that you're scaling your technology. And so go ahead, Ryan.
So just to put this in there, so for our audience's point of view, what you're saying is that in the last month, potentially the average firm, which has, let's say, 4 email servers and 41 web servers, which may be supporting different web applications like the website or their Outlook web access, potentially 358 of their staff accounts may have had passwords exposed. So that means that anybody who has access to the company's network could be, and if they have this many email addresses and servers, they potentially could have access to everything on the corporate network. Is that what we're trying to get across here, you think?
It's certainly possible. And I think we all know that sometimes we sign up for things with our work email, and sometimes we use a password that we used somewhere else because it's one we can remember. That's how these crimes of opportunity occur. And that's exactly the point that we're trying to make here, Ryan, is that this is the reality of the level of exposure. Now, I also want to make the case that many, many firms take very seriously these cyber challenges and have implemented robust internal compensating controls to help manage their level of exposure, and that many firms are well aware of this type of exposure. But on the flip side, many are not. And your goal is to help understand in your portfolio who has this elevated level of exposure. And given that, and given what I know about my portfolio of firms and the work they do for me and the value they add to my organization, can I bring in another factor to help contextualize this? So on the top is just the raw exposure distribution. And you might want to start your diligence or offer enhanced diligence, or go talk to the firms who are, really facing a lot of cyber risk, right? Who have those high levels of exposure, who are performing below average in terms of your portfolio. That would be one way to do it. Another way to think about this would be to say, great, I want to add another element to the analysis. Maybe it's spend or matter volume, or something that will help me prioritize this list of 50, 100, 400 firms, because I can't talk to them all. I can't do a diligence exercise on them all, but I want to start by managing the risk that has the most likelihood of occurring, as well as the most impact should it occur. And these risk terms that you might hear around kind of inherent risk or impact are things that you're intimately familiar with, you just might not think of them in this context. You know who your biggest firms are, you know who your most important firms are, and by bringing together your internal inherent knowledge of these organizations and the real world levels of exposure, I think the opportunity to start to add value, to manage this cyber risk, to be tangible about reducing exposure to these opportunistic attacks is well within the grasp of anybody on the audience today.
So Shay did a great job walking us through what this risks look like and some of the indicators that you can look at and see out there, right? You can find out registrations. You know, I won't take credit for the picture, but I'll just share a thought about security metrics just because I think it's impactful there, is that when you go to a company website, I mean, you can clearly tell whether it's and while there are vulnerabilities behind even the most slick website, a GeoCities page that your law firm is hosting versus a well-built, up-to-date with a HTTPS, there's clear differences, right? Very similar to when you drove past that house. You know it's not a 1940s craftsman bungalow that you want to necessarily purchase unless you're looking for a fixer-upper. So we've talked about how you can avoid this risk. The key thing, though, from an operational process is really make it part of your onboarding and due diligence if it isn't already, right? Think about how you can engage with the firms on the onboarding side, right? You need to procure different services with them. How do you understand this? And time is always of the essence, which goes back to the point Shay made earlier about the fact that you don't have to engage them right away. You should only have to engage them when you find indicators that you need to, or the prioritization of the data is so high that you need to engage them in an overt manner to ask more questions about these compensating controls. If you have the ability to understand their external cybersecurity posture or the risk exposure, it'll put you in a much better place to start making decisions with that onboarding process and making decisions on who you want to engage and how. Understanding the data governance that you have internally is critical, right? What data are you sharing should be part of your procurement process if it isn't already. If not, understanding the stakeholders and who's involved in terms of the business unit's goals and what they want to do with this entity. I mean, keep in mind that there are multiple ways in which you could engage your legal vendors that may trigger all sorts of different opportunistic and other events, right? So if you're engaging a law firm that has a lobbying arm, they may also lobby for nation states and other institutions and other groups that might be of interest. So there are all sorts of different engagements and structures that may elicit more risk. So it's important to have just a clear, pardon the pun, clarity around how your business units are engaging with this law firm. Some quick wins out of all this is, again, that conversation. You know, talk about the legal vendor breach aspect with your stakeholders and business units, right? What would happen if our favorite law firm got breached? How do we understand the risk exposure? What are we doing today? What do we like to do? How often do we do it? What's our cadence? And then prioritize your portfolio. As Shay said earlier, you know your firm is best. There's probably nobody in your company who knows more about where each dollar is going and why. But adding that vector of their potential exposure, adding that vector of the risk will help you prioritize. You know, we give this firm a lot of money and a lot of resources, a lot of data. We don't really actually understand the potential risk exposure. You know, we know that they seem great people, but let's just ask a few more questions. Or conversely, if you've got a lot in a certain zone and you don't have a lot of time, doing that external look will help you prioritize and say, okay, they're all about the same, but this one came in really low. Can we pivot? Do we need to engage further? Do we need to better understand it? And that'll help you prioritize. Further, establishing that internal threshold, again, that conversation. What risks are we okay with? Not everybody's perfect. Not everybody's going to have a wonderful looking website and the right tools. And not everybody's going to have the right controls, even if they have the right externally facing things. It's okay to have a conversation around what level of risk are we tolerating, right? What's our risk appetite? We do that for our 401ks. There's no difference for us having that conversation with regards to the breaches that we look out there. And of course, you want to engage resources, right? This is, in many cases, for some of you on this is a new field that you're having to be called into because of all the things that Shay just walked us through and we talked about last week. This is an emerging risk that we can no longer avoid. It is not something that we can wholeheartedly say, we're not going to have to worry about this because cyber is just something that happens in movies. It's a reality every day. But there are resources, both internal and external, right? Your own cybersecurity teams, your own resources. There are companies you can pull upon. There are also resources like the Legal ISAO and others that are out there. Sylvia is producing a wonderful amount of content. We're working with her on this that you can refer back to better understand how you can build a program and understand things, which ultimately is what you want to try to get towards. You want to have a coherent, risk-aware program that helps you prioritize your engagement with your firms from a security metric and allows you to, as Shay said, move collaboratively towards better successes. I think if we take anything away from this presentation, and I'll let Shay have the last word, is that we really want to build a collaborative relationship. You want your legal vendor ecosystem is truly that, right? It is a garden of firms that you work with. You want them to do well. You want them to be secure. You don't want bad things to happen to them. And engaging with them helps in that process. I'll just do a quick pitch for next week and then turn things over to Shay for the last thing, because Shay is actually hosting next week's. But we're going to be talking to a couple of our friends, at Prudential about their cyber risk program, how they built it, what they thought about with it, and really trying to understand how do you mitigate this risk, from whole through the process, right? They have been down for a while on this one, and have some really interesting stories and perspectives that I think many of you will get some value from. And it'll be hosted, of course, by Shay, who, as I said before, knows probably far more than he should about different hacking penetration tactics and the like. But Shay, I'll let you kind of close this out with some parting thoughts before we yield over to questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ryan. I think the parting thought for me is the notion that you can do this. You can get a handle on cyber risk in your portfolio and generate and participate in conversations that make a difference. Your understanding of the strategic relationship of these firms to your organization, of these vendors to what you're trying to do for your business, will be the cornerstone that will help both your internal stakeholders and the external stakeholders at those firms understand what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. And not in a punitive way. You're not trying to catch anybody out on a poor performance. Really, that notion of we want to do this, we want to address cyber risk so that we can continue to partner with you. And in fact, in many ways, partner with you more deeply because we have this enhanced understanding of how you are thinking about the risk and managing our shared risk in this data and relationship. And so again, the demystification of cyber risk and leveraging back on the knowledge that you have, supplementing with data that you can get to make those conversations tangible. So I know I did see a couple of questions come in. I think what I'd like to do at this point, Sylvia, is go ahead and wrap up the recorded portion of it and open the line up to audience questions.